You ever hear someone say something and just cringe? You think, ugh, who even talks like that? Or, you've heard your parents, or maybe even yourself, complain about the way kids today speak. Well, it turns out language is always changing, and that constant evolution, it's fascinating, but let's be real, it can also be kind of frustrating. So let's get into it and figure out what's really going on. Okay, take a phrase like this. She was like, "This is so cool." Come on, you've probably said this, you have definitely heard it. This use of the word like to introduce what someone said or even just thought, linguists call it a quotative. It's one of the fastest spreading changes in modern English. And yeah, it started with younger speakers, but now you hear it from people well into their 30s, 40s, and beyond. And for a lot of folks, this right here, this is Exhibit A for everything they think is wrong with the language.
So that really gets to the heart of it, doesn't it? Why do people complain so much? For centuries, literally, people have looked at language changing and seen it as, well, as decay. They think it's just sloppiness or laziness or that it's a sign of bad education. And they especially think that when the new ways of talking come from young people. But is that really what's happening?
Nope, not even close. See, linguists who study this stuff, sociolinguists, they have a completely different take. And here's the absolute key. Variation isn't a mistake. It's the normal default setting for any living language. The only way we can even begin to understand how new things spread is if we first accept that language is supposed to be variable. In fact, that variation, it's the very engine that drives all language change.
And this variation, it's everywhere. It happens on every single level of language. Just think about it for a second. When you say the word talking, do you hit that hard G at the end, or are you more of a talkin' person? What about that thing you sit on in your living room? Is it a sofa, a couch, maybe even a Chesterfield, depending on where you're from? See? These aren't mistakes. They're just different ways of saying the same thing, and they are absolutely packed with social information about who we are.
And what's really cool is that linguists actually have a name for these little features. They call them sociolinguistic variables. It's basically any part of language, a sound, a word, a piece of grammar, that changes based on social stuff. We're talking about your age, your social class, your gender, even just who you're talking to at that moment. These variables, they're like breadcrumbs. They're the clues that let us follow the trail and map out how language changes over time.
Okay, so how do we actually study all these patterns? Well, over the years, researchers have basically looked at this stuff through 3 different lenses. They call them waves of research. And each wave kind of zooms in a little closer on what really makes us speak the way we do. So let's jump in with the first one.
All right, lens number 1. This first wave of research, which really kicked off back in the 1960s, took a big picture, bird's-eye view. The idea was to look at these massive social categories, mostly social class, and see if they could find clear connections between where you stood on the social ladder and the specific way you talked.
And here's a perfect case study that shows exactly how this works. A linguist named Peter Trudgill went to the city of Norwich in England to look at that exact talkin' versus talking thing we mentioned earlier. And the results? They were just crystal clear. He found that in casual conversation, men from the lower working class used the informal talkin' form 100% of the time. Meanwhile, men from the middle class, they only used it about 31% of the time. I mean, that's a seriously powerful link between social class and how you speak.
But, society is way more than just these big, broad categories like class, right? So the second wave of research zoomed in a little closer. It started looking at things on a more personal level, our social networks. The idea here is that language change isn't just about your class, it's about the actual specific people you talk to every single day.
So think about your own social circle for a second. Is it really tight-knit? Like, do you live, work, and hang out with basically the same group of people? Linguists call that a multiplex network. And those kinds of groups are really good at keeping things the same and resisting new changes. Or is your network a bit looser? Maybe your work friends don't know your family, who don't know your hobby friends? That's a uniplex network. And if that's you, you're much more likely to run into new ways of talking and to be one of the people who helps spread them.
There's this amazing study from Belfast that shows this perfectly. So the city at the time was really divided. A new language feature started up among Protestant men in one part of the city. The big question was, how in the world did it end up in the way young Catholic women were talking on the complete other side of town? The answer was their social networks. It turns out these young women all worked together in a shop right in the city center, a kind of neutral ground. And there, they talked to people from the Protestant community. They basically became linguistic bridges, carrying this new feature back to their own neighborhoods.
Okay, so the third wave, which is the most recent one, zooms in even tighter. This one has a really different perspective. It says language isn't just a passive reflection of who you are. It's an active tool that we all use to build our identities. It's not just about your class or your friends. It's about how you perform who you are inside what researchers call communities of practice. Basically, any group of people that comes together to do something, whether it's a sports team, a band, or a group of friends at school.
And the classic example here is Penny Eckert's incredible study of a high school near Detroit. She found two main social groups. You had the jocks, who were all about the school and its values, and you had the burnouts, who wanted nothing to do with it. And it was the burnouts who were more connected to the local working class who were driving all the language change. They were using new ways of pronouncing vowels as a way to signal their rebellion, to build their own unique identity. The jocks, on the other hand, tended to stick to the standard, more conservative way of talking.
But here's where it gets really interesting. Eventually, the jocks started using some of the burnouts' new speech patterns. So, how did that happen? Well, it was through a middle group that Eckert called the in-betweens. These were kids who had friends in both groups. They would pick up the new ways of talking from the burnouts, but when they used them, they kind of stripped away the rebellious meaning. They made the new words and sounds safe enough for the jocks to start using too. It's a perfect example of how we use language to show who we want to be like, and who we don't.
All right, so we've looked at the big social reasons why there are so many different ways of talking. But what about the how? How does one person's brand new slang word or pronunciation actually catch on and spread through an entire society? Well, it almost always follows this really predictable pattern that linguists call the S-curve. Think of it in 3 stages. First, you have initiation. Just a few innovators start using a new thing. It's a really slow start. Then you hit the expansion phase. Early adopters grab onto it, and suddenly, boom! Its use just explodes and spreads like wildfire. And finally, you get to termination. The spread slows way down as pretty much everyone is using the new form, though you might still have a few holdouts using the old way.
Let's take a real-world example. It's called TH fronting. That's when people pronounce the TH sound in a word like 3 as an F sound, so it sounds like free. Now, you might think this change would spread like a slow wave across the country, but it didn't. Instead, it jumped. It was first noticed in London way back in the 1850s. Then, poof, it pops up in Bristol 30 years later. Then Reading in the 1950s, then all the way up to Glasgow in the 80s. It was literally leapfrogging from one major city to another, following the main routes of travel and communication.
So, we've covered a ton of ground, right? We can see how variation works, we can map how it spreads, we can even understand the social identities people are building with it. But there's still one huge fundamental question, one ultimate mystery that still keeps linguists up at night.
It's known as the actuation problem. And to put it really simply, it's the question of why? Why does a particular change start in a particular place at a particular time? We're getting really good at explaining how a change spreads once it gets going, but we still can't fully explain that very first spark that lights the whole fire.
And that right there is the biggest puzzle in language change. Why did using like to quote someone take off in the late 20th century and not, say, the 18th century? Why did that fuss sound for th start in London and not Liverpool or Manchester? We can watch the whole process unfold with incredible detail, but that ultimate origin, that very first flicker of change, it's still one of the biggest mysteries about the very thing that makes us human. It's definitely something to think about the next time you hear some new piece of slang and wonder, where did that come from?